It's hard to explain to the younger generations just how big Halo used to be, and whilst the series has limped along, after a trio of failures, capped off by a bitterly disappointing Infinite, 343 Studios has been rebooted. What if I told you that the last good Halo game was released more than 14 years ago, boasted a story that we already knew the ending to, and didn't even feature Master Chief? The year is 2010. Apple unveils the first iPad. Instagram arrives to give everyone a chance to show off their lunch, and other things. And the last good Halo game is launched on the Xbox 360. With the state of the series these days, it's hard to imagine just how big a cultural phenomenon the Halo series was. Halo Combat Evolved hard carried the original Xbox, and in a period where Nintendo were off doing their own thing and Sega were going bust, Microsoft became the main competitor for Sony and the PlayStation. The Halo games were one of, if not the, driving force behind many people's choice to pick up an Xbox, and so the Chief became Microsoft's poster boy. But Halo started life as an RTS game developed for the Mac. The game morphed into a third-person shooter and was even announced by Apple CEO Steve Jobs himself in 1999. Bungie, however, was struggling financially, living off the success of Myth and suffering a huge blow when a bug in Myth 2 that deleted users' files was identified only after 200,000 copies had been produced. With options running out, Bungie approached Microsoft about an acquisition. Fortunately, Microsoft were looking to build a games catalogue for their upcoming console debut, and came to an arrangement that saw them acquire Bungie and the Halo IP. Bungie had to turn Halo from a loose collection of gameplay and plot ideas into a shipping product on a brand new console within a year. To make players feel more connected to the action, the game's perspective shifted from third person to first person. Open world ambitions and campaign levels were cut to enable the team to meet the tight deadline, and a chaotic cross-discipline approach was required for the team to get the sheer amount of work and testing done. Other Bungie projects were scrapped and their teams absorbed into the Halo push. Some team members claimed that after moving to the new location in Redmond, they were too busy to unpack for the first 6 months. Another challenge was the fact that first-person shooters weren't that common on consoles yet. Making the game work with the Xbox's gamepad was a challenge that required innovation, leading to designer Jamie Grismer writing code to discern player intent and assist the player's movement and aiming without being obvious. The game buffered player inputs, so that the result was the desired player movement rather than the movement players were actually making. Yay for aim assist. Out of all this chaos, however, Halo would emerge to critical and player acclaim, winning more than 40 awards, modernising the FPS genre, and making the Xbox a viable contender in the console space. Over the course of the next decade, the Halo series would dominate the industry, helping spearhead online multiplayer on consoles, fueling a slowly growing esports scene, and spawning many montage videos and content creators, helping to propel Xbox from zero to a serious competitor in the console wars, arguably even winning the 7th generation with the Xbox 360. Halo games are identified by a few key elements. Naturally, the world and characters, Spartans, Covenant, Halo Ring worlds, etc. Not least of all our unstoppable hero, who will no doubt overcome any challenge the Covenant throw his way. Halo games also had an obvious art style, prioritizing bright and colourful visuals filled with bright blue plasma, purple vehicles, and neon pink needle weapons. This stood in stark contrast to many of the other FPS games of the time, and made the game easily identifiable. Meanwhile, gameplay-wise, the traditional Halo game was built on a core trilogy of guns, grenades, and melee, with Halo opting to make both grenades and melee instantly accessible to the player, without forcing you to holster your weapon, speeding up their use and making them more viable as part of a combination. It's also worth making a quick mention to the vehicle-heavy levels of Halo 2. We all remember gunning it in a Warthog through an exploding Pillar of Autumn, or across a collapsing ring world. And so with this in mind, Reach sticks out as an unusual Halo game. The most obvious departure in Reach is the story. For starters, the final Halo game Bungie made didn't feature Master Chief or Cortana. And what's more, not only does our main character not overcome the threat of the Covenant, but we all know from the outset the sad fate of Reach and Noble Team. The knowledge the player has of Reach going into the game could have led to a story without stakes. Instead, the game becomes about the journey rather than the destination. For me, Reach is the best Halo story, and it's precisely because we know the tragic fate that awaits us. The story progresses with enough ups and downs, following the classic oscillating narrative, that whilst the outcome of Reach is a foregone conclusion for the player, they are also kept engaged and hopeful that if not the planet, then lives at least can be saved. A hope that is ground down throughout the second half of the game, as the entirety of Noble Team is taken out one by one. Well, except Jun, capping little bitch. Each of Noble Squad are introduced to the player in their own buddy mission, allowing you to get a feel for the characters and become invested. Emil kind of gets neglected in the character bonding, and the breakneck speed of the campaign where we're run through set piece after set piece does mean that the characters aren't fully developed and tend to lean on tropes. But for a series that had largely focused on the Chief and Cortana, it's quite a departure. The small dialogue lines during missions and the cutscenes help give some sense of individuality to the Spartans, and for the first time, we see the people under the helmets. We learn about George's relationship to Reach and the Spartan project over the course of the early game, and so his sacrifice hits. Bungie had given us side characters like the Arbiter and Sergeant Johnson before, but here they demonstrate the lessons learned and in a short space of time make you care about his sacrifice and feel the bitter disappointment at it being for nothing. It's not all doom and gloom either. There's a constant theme of defiance, and even after George's sacrifice, Carter states he gave his life thinking he had just saved the planet. We should all be so lucky. That said, the futility of his sacrifice adds to that grinding sense of impending defeat. The sudden death of Kat mid-sentence just after you reunite and feel relief after a series of tense, low ammo, isolated missions is a perfect example of the oscillating narrative that keeps the player engaged and wondering what or who next. The game also doesn't hold back on the desperation and the brutality of the invasion. After landing back on Reach after Operation Uppercut, you find yourself battling for an overrun city, listening to desperate comms chatter as evacuation ships, civilians and soldiers alike, plead for assistance and reinforcements from an overwhelmed command. This is the backdrop to a map where you're short of ammo and surrounded by the corpses of Marines and civilians alike, often shown huddled for cover or against walls, seemingly executed. Even set pieces such as the many Falcon flights where you're strapped into the turret serve to show you numerous small fights taking place, where ordinary Marines are shown fighting for their lives against Covenant forces, particularly brutes, often being outnumbered and overwhelmed as you're flown out of your turret's range. A subtle way to immerse the player into a sense of helplessness as their reticule is unable to keep on target and assist. Maybe I'm just a glutton for punishment, but seeing the environments in the latter missions tell the story of a futile battle for survival, the moments of hope and triumph, the futility of sacrifices made, and the mortality of the hitherto unstoppable Spartans, all adds to a Halo story unlike those before, and it was honestly a ballsy decision by Bungie. So let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. Armor abilities had a massive impact on gameplay and were not particularly well received. Whilst the classic trilogy of guns, grenades and melee remains the core foundation, Bungie attempted to modernise the game and keep up with the hugely popular Call of Duty. Armor abilities add some variety in the campaign and allow for missions to be approached in a few different ways, and in the case of the jetpack, allow entirely new ways to traverse missions and to engage the enemy. In multiplayer, however, many found the new armor abilities incredibly frustrating, not least of all those in the competitive scene. Unfortunately, MLG and lower level competitions slowly dried up and dropped Halo. And 343 failed to learn the right lessons from Reach and pushed the competitive players further away with Halo 4. A more competitive multiplayer gaming space also meant that the Halo series didn't have the time and space to recover from these speed bumps. Halo 2 and 3 are still held up as the best Halo multiplayer experiences, And given the LAN sessions and copious amounts of time online I had with both, I can't say I disagree. But Bungie were right to try something new, even if it didn't quite work out. And, unlike Infinite, the game featured a huge variety of game modes, maps, and a fully fledged Forge mode and custom game setup, meaning you're always able to find some game type or map you wanted to play. Fundamentally, whilst I didn't love armor abilities, the game was still very playable. It just no longer operated in a vacuum, and Halo was overtaken by Call of Duty, Battlefield, and other games. As mentioned before, the armor abilities also freshened up some of the campaign missions, allowing for missions that wouldn't have been possible otherwise, such as bunny hopping around with a group of ODSTs. I've already said abilities weren't my favourite thing at the time, but they do allow for some interesting interactions. And the jump jet mission, scattered with hammers, is clearly designed to sell the player on the experience. And as anyone who has played Space Marine 2 will tell you, jetpacks and melee weapons are great fun. Like any Halo game, we also have a few vehicle heavy missions, such as the standard Warthog turret run and Scorpion tank rampage. Flying missions also make memorable appearances, with the player both piloting and serving as turret gunner for the new Falcon. We even ended up in space, dogfighting with the Covenant to protect a station from attack, and get some low gravity gameplay as we board a Covenant ship and turn it into a bomb. My only real gripe would be that sometimes the game feels like set piece after set piece, but this all makes for a hell of a swan song for Bungie. Unfortunately, since Reach and Bungie's departure, it's been mostly downhill for the Halo franchise. Halo 4 and Halo 5 were both broadly panned by fans of the series, as 343 Studios struggled to modernise the games to appeal to a broader audience. Gameplay-wise, Halo 4 was seen as a large departure from the series standard. Whilst it wasn't my favourite, it's unfair to suggest that that's the only or main reason the games have failed. As discussed, Reach and Bungie were already experimenting with new gameplay mechanics, and Halo itself had been a trailblazer in console FPS gaming, so trying new things was a part of the game's identity. That said, many fans felt that the newer games lacked the Halo identity, with the gameplay changes echoed in changes to the game's look, opting for more realism with muted colour palettes in line with other modern games of the time. This came with a wave of new story threads with ever more emphasis put on emotional depth, particularly around the Chief and Cortana's relationship. Again, this was in contrast to the focus on mystery and epic stakes of the earlier games. The problem was that the depth didn't feel particularly sincere when threads were routinely left unresolved or wrapped up off screen without any real satisfaction for the player. At some points it's hard to remember who you're fighting and why they are such a threat. These changes together, particularly when viewed through the lens of the Halo fanbase, often came across as 343 trying to jump on popular trends at the expense of the soul of the Halo games. The saddest thing is that many of these issues were resolved with the studio's last stab at a Halo game, Halo Infinite. Infinite saw gameplay that leaned back in on the golden triangle of guns, melee and grenades. The art style injected more colour than previous outings, and honestly, it felt great playing a new Halo game that felt the way I remembered Halo 2 and 3 feeling. The problem, however, was aggressive monetization strategies, a lack of content and features on release that were seen as standard requirements such as co-op campaigns, Forge and frankly more maps and game modes. Arguably though, the real killer was the buggy netcode and server performance which killed multiplayer for many, something that would traditionally be the core offering for a Halo game, and if resolved or not present to begin with, would have made the other sins more forgivable. As a Halo fan who had been desperately waiting for the feeling of a Halo game, it was bitterly disappointing to have such inconsistent multiplayer experiences, and to miss out on co-op entirely. Quite how these glaring omissions were allowed to happen, and why server performance was so poor, is something we likely won't hear the truth about, but when coupled with the monetization, it definitely came across as Microsoft and 343 neglecting the series, as the general popularity and sales figures had been dwindling, leading to underinvestment, whilst also seeking to exploit the Halo brand to milk the fans for money. Cosmetics you'd have previously unlocked through achievements and a progression system were now unlocked via microtransactions and a rather lackluster battle pass. Whilst this sin was certainly not unique to Infinite, it was another modernisation nail in the nostalgia coffin. One key reason for the less than charitable reading of the situation is almost certainly because of the way in which 343 came to be. The studio was founded by Microsoft for the specific purpose of creating Halo titles. It was public knowledge that Bungie wanted the creative freedom to pursue new projects, and that the cost of their freedom was the Halo IP. As such, there was always going to be a cynical eye cast upon whoever followed their footsteps, with many, rightly or wrongly, seeing Microsoft as viewing Halo as a cash cow. And so 343 came to be seen as the puppets for Microsoft whilst Bungie left, being perceived as true creatives who left the safety of Microsoft in order to create art, or at least better games. Whether that's a fair perception or not, it certainly influenced the way many looked at the games that would come later. 343 were unfortunately fighting a battle against those perceptions, and the early miss with Halo 4, where the game was broadly seen as trying to jump on modern trends, certainly didn't help. It's not necessarily fair, but it appears that Microsoft have recognised that the 343 brand is tainted at this point, with the studio being rebooted and renamed to Halo Studios, alongside a shift to Unreal 5 for the game engine. This shift to Unreal probably means that future games will have an easier time delivering multiplayer experiences that aren't plagued by server issues. It does, however, indicate an admission of failure and a lack of ambition. Whether Halo Studios will be able to, or encouraged to, innovate and experiment in Unreal as much as Bungie were able to is yet to be seen. And the use of Unreal Engine also raises questions about the homogenization of the AAA space. But that's a topic for another day. For now, it's time to wrap up, and to recommend anyone too young to have played Reach or the other Bungie Halos to give them a go. And for those of you that did, I strongly recommend you revisit the bittersweet Reach campaign. The desperate story and set pieces alone make it worth a replay if you haven't played it recently. And the knowledge of the tragic fate of Noble Team genuinely didn't hurt my enjoyment of the story a second time round. And unlike so many of the story threads dotted across the latest Halo games, I actually gave a shit. Given all the headaches and heartbreaks of the 343 Studios games, Halo Reach really does feel like the last Halo game worth playing. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, it really helps, and feel free to suggest the next game in the comments below. But most importantly, thanks for watching.